Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
And good Sunday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 11th of December, and as always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather information at weather.gov/Alaska, or call us on the Alaska Weather Information Line at 800-472-0391. If you have questions about the website, about the forecast, about something you saw in your part of Alaska, we'd love to hear about it, and you can send us an email to the entire weather team at nws.ar.tvweather@noaa.gov. And again, if you've got a weather picture and like to see it here on Alaska Weather, let us know. We'd be happy to share it with everybody else too. Here's a look at our hazardous weather situation tonight across northern parts of southeast. As you go up toward White Pass, we've got a wind chill advisory that's in effect right now and will continue until noon tomorrow or so, about 11 o'clock actually. We're looking for the wind plus the temperature combined to make it feel like it could be 30 below in some cases. And doing a little bit of simple math, it brings it to about 30 minutes or so for exposure on your skin before you could get frostbite. So about 30 minutes at 30 below would not be good if you're traveling through White Pass. So a wind chill advisory is still in effect from our friends at the Juneau National Weather Service office for the White Pass region through about 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. Here's a look at what else is going on across a large part of Alaska. You don't see a whole lot of movement here across the interior. That's because there are no clouds, even though you see the milky white colored in there across most of Alaska. That's just cold air showing up on the satellite picture. Most of southeast was relatively clear. Most of the northern Gulf, Kodiak, all the way to the Alaska Peninsula was generally clear today, and that is because we have a large dome of high pressure that is nothing but cold across the region. It is going to stay that way, at least for the next couple days. Out to the west, you see a broad southerly flow sweeping into low pressure across the western Bering Sea and the northwest Pacific. As such, southerlies will gradually take over more parts of the central and eastern Bering Sea and gradually replace that bitter cold that we have out across parts of the west with something a little bit more maybe seasonable, maybe slightly above average as well. General conditions, though, are going to be stable across a large part of central, southern, and southeastern Alaska, with the west under a little bit of a change. It's not too hard to pick out the upper air pattern. If you look carefully here, you can pretty much trace it out. It's that upside down U shape that we talk about sometimes, and as you well know, if you tune into Alaska Weather on a routine basis, when we see that in the weather pattern, it's a slow mover for Alaska, and we've been under this cold now for, I'd say, at least a week or so. And many locations there will continue to be pretty cold across central and the east and southeast, experiencing fairly quiet or benign weather. Now, there's going to be some winds from time to time, and you might see some clouds passing through, but this is a weather maker that doesn't like to budge. But we are seeing signs of it changing, though, with this southerly flow creeping in across the western parts of the Bering Sea. Here's a look at the surface chart, and if you look from the top down, you would see a pretty much full control here of high pressure from the western Yukon into the interior at 1,047 millibars. That is some pretty strong high pressure, and of course with the cold air, that's not much of a surprise. Across eastern Siberia, 1,028 millibar high pressure system, and just off the screen, that's at 983 millibars, but it will deepen rapidly as we go ahead in the next couple frames and takes us into Tuesday. Some light rain there across Unalaska and Dutch Harbor, out toward Nikolsky and eastward up the southern tip of the Alaska Peninsula today, and where the colder air got into the mix a little bit better. Across southwestern Alaska, we had some pockets of light snow. Most places reported very little, if any, precipitation across the region. Cold Bay was one of those places that picked up some light rain, about 0.2 of an inch or so. Otherwise, severe clear in many parts of southeast. South central had some ice fog, and places like Birchwood and down into the northern part of Cook Inlet saw some ice fog this morning, and many across the central and eastern interior will experience similar conditions as we go ahead in the next couple days, and same with the north slope there. Chances are, even though the OB is reporting snow, it's probably just some ice crystals falling in the region. Now, out across the west, a front will continue moving across the central and western Bering Sea as we go through tonight. Out ahead of that, that southerly flow is picking up, and you'll notice how those isobars are kind of being condensed across the central and eastern chain, as well as the southern tip of the Alaska Peninsula. That is moving southerly warm air up across the Bering Strait, across the western tip of the Seward Peninsula, and into the Chukchi Sea. Now, why would I mention that? Well, the Chukchi Sea, as many of you have been watching, has been experiencing less and less open water in the last couple days, as cold air has certainly been building in there thanks to our big monster ridge of high pressure. Well, if it weren't for that southerly wind coming in, we'd probably close off the whole thing, but that's not going to happen. Southerly winds are moving in, and low concentrations of ice will likely be broken up and moved around in the next couple days with that southerly flow. In the meantime, for southeast, you'll see there's a tighter pressure gradient picking up here, so won't be surprised to see some gusty winds shaping up in some of the normal places there. If you're in southeast and usually get a decent little valley wind cranking up, perhaps your area will be getting some of those breezes soon. For Monday, notice out west, the front marching across the Bering is falling apart. Why? It's running into a brick wall of weather. High pressure with that cold, dry, stable air mass across Alaska is preventing this from making any forceward movement into the east. And as such, you'll see some clouds moving in, but it's really not going to make its way all the way into the interior. Across the north, though, a little bit of a trough of low pressure working across the north slope. That, too, not terribly strong, and it will fizzle apart as it already is at this point on Monday. Down to the south and west, to 970 millibar lows working across the central and western Aleutians. We'll see some strong gales with that, maybe slightly stronger winds out across the west, but more than anything else, rain and wind and higher seas will be the expectation as we get into Monday and Tuesday. Across the Gulf, high pressure still in charge at over 1,030 millibars. Generally clear conditions for southeast, showers well to your south, and dry and clear conditions for south central and a large part of the central interior. As we get into Wednesday, you'll definitely see more clouds across the interior. Not a whole lot of precipitation chances just yet, but a disturbance is trying to cut in on the weather system here, and at 1,030 millibars, it represents a slight interruption in that flow. Out to the west, we start to see some pockets of light snow developing here and there as more moisture moves into the cold and stable environment there. Most of that will remain on the west coast. Out across the central and western Bering, a 957 millibar low now is clearly on the weather picture, and into the central and western chain, periods of rain and snow showers should be expected. We get that southerly flow that's still working across Bristol Bay and the Alaska Peninsula. For more of the Gulf, we start to see more unsettled conditions. They're cutting in on the northern part of this high pressure system. The stable weather's moving to the south, and we still have some leftovers of stability across south central, but with a trough of low pressure here across Cook Inlet, we see that is starting to break down. For southeast, clear, dry sky there, it looks like for most of Tuesday, but not really that far away from home is this trough of low pressure, and pockets of clouds and showers will start to creep in on that as well. So changes are coming, but changes in this weather regime are certainly slow. Around the temperatures we go, and teens, 20s, and 30s for most of southeast today. You can see Juneau holding at 30 degrees, and many areas around Sitka all the way down into the southern straits. We're in the upper 20s and low 30s today. Certainly a cold day for many in southeast, and down toward Haida Gwaii. Yakutat clocked in at 19 degrees today, 16 for Cordova and Valdez. Seward and Homer both in the low to mid 20s. It was 8 in Kenai, 8 in Anchorage, and 23 below by 3 o'clock around Golconda. Now, that doesn't seem so bad when you saw morning temperatures that were below 30 below, and then we were still seeing temperatures that cold up around Toke and upward toward Chicken. Eagle and Northway are also some of the colder readings there. Northway began the morning at 35 below. That was the coldest official temperature we noticed. 14 below around Fairbanks, 26 below around Fort Yukon, and the cold kind of eased up a little bit as you moved up in the higher terrain there. As you worked over into the north slope, though, temps were about 10 to 20 below for the Beaufort Seacoast. 7 below in Barrow. At Kasuka, only 6 below. 23 above as you get out toward the western capes and points there. Anywhere from 5 to 10 below across Kotzebue Sound. Shishmaref was 2 below. 3 above in Nome, 22 for St. Lawrence Island and around Gamble. 19 below in McGrath. Galena, only 15 below. 3 above around Grayling and Russian Mission, and as you get out toward Spiravant, temperatures there were hovering a little closer to 0, not a whole lot. Bethel was 4 above. Lake Iliamna saw temps in the low teens. King Salmon was 3 above. Dillingham, 20 above, 33 in Cape Newenham. And you saw temps in the mid-30s for Kodiak Island. Teens, 20s, and 30s down the Alaska Peninsula we go. Sand Point, a very mild 43. And some of the warmest weather in all of Alaska today in the mid-40s for Adak and Atka. Shemya was not reporting this afternoon. As you look at overnight low temps, we'll stay in the low to mid-teens for most of southeast and the Panhandle. Yakutat 11.5 for Cordova. And as you get into the interior and some of the Copper River Basin, temperatures will go well below zero, and probably they've been there most of the day, so no big surprise. Places like Golcana 24 below. Anchorage looking at temps at or just above zero. Kenai could be colder. Around Talkeetna 15 below. Fairbanks looking at 10 below. Fort Yukon 30 below. The North Slope from 5 to 10 below. Kotzebue Sound temps anywhere from 7 above to about 1 below. Nome looking at 14. It looks like about 33 below for McGrath. Southwest coast temperatures anywhere from 5 to about 10 above Ammonok, and areas out around Nunivak Island probably closer to 20. 24 around Kodiak and low to mid-30s for the Alaska Peninsula. 33 in St. Paul and mid-30s for the central and western chain. High temps there tomorrow, back in the low 40s. The Alaska Peninsula at or above freezing for many places from Port Hyden south. 37 in Kodiak, Dillingham 24, around 23 in Bethel. Unalakleet and Shaktoolik, probably around 13 degrees. 23 in Nome, 13 in Barrow. 24 below in Fort Yukon, about 5 to 10 below for Fairbanks in the central interior. Golcana up to a whopping 12 below. Northway and Eagle still holding between about 5 and 20 below. South central temperatures mostly in the single digits. A few in the Kenai Peninsula could make it into the teens. And southeast, you're looking at temps in the 20s and 30s tomorrow. On to flying weather. Severe clear for most of the interior and southeast. The action's out in the west and the Chukchi Coast with IFR in the morning there from Barrow southward and along St. Paul and St. George all the way down to Unalaska and Nikolsky. And you'll see that moving eastward throughout the day. Still clear in the southeast, in the interior and south central. The west coast dealing with increasing IFR along the coast and for the central chain. With that said, you can do the pass maps with me today. You ready? Here we go. VFR for Anaktuvik, Adigan Pass, VFR for Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, Rainy Pass and Windy Pass. And can we do it in one breath? I don't know. Isabel Pass, Mentasta Pass, no. Tanita Pass, VFR, Portage Pass, also looking at VFR, Chilkoot and White Pass, VFR. We'll try again tomorrow. Freezing levels indicate that warm air is lifting northward toward St. Matthew and the Pribilofs, 2, 4, and 6,000 foot levels seen out west. The surface freezing line, of course, just below and south of southeast and over Kodiak Island and west of Nunivak Island because it's cold. The icing potential does show some elevated moisture working across the northern Bering, and you'll probably start to have some issues with that in the light to isolated moderate range above 2,000 feet. And that starts to creep into the western edge of Kotzebue Sound and the western tip of the Seward Peninsula, as well as areas west of Adak to about Kiska above 5,000 feet. The jet stream has that pronounced ridge across western parts of Alaska, but this is being invaded on by areas of low pressure on either side of this, and this next system is trying to force that stronger southerly flow up the west coast, and it will probably succeed, but as all things weather, it does take a little bit of time when you have such a large and in charge area of high pressure that we see at 9,000 feet here. Here's that upside down U-shaped pattern we were talking about with those westerlies working across the interior, generally light at about 20 knots or so. Stronger southerlies develop out across the west. Wind speeds crank up to about 50 to 75 knots, blowing in that warm air across the Bering and eventually up into the Chukchi Sea and kind of roughing up the ice that's been trying to form all season. North and northeasterly winds are sweeping across southeast at about 10 to 20 knots. They pick up to 35 knots offshore, and high pressure is really slowing down the winds aloft over south central Alaska. No big change there at 3,000 feet over some of the higher terrain that starts to speed up to about 15 to 20 knots around the ridge. Otherwise, southerlies in the west as high as 65 knots across the central chain. Westerlies are working in across the Beaufort Seacoast and the Chukchi Coast. A little bit more of a northwesterly flow there west of Barrow at 10 knots. And north and easterly winds are sweeping across southeast gently at about 10 to 15 knots. All in all, pattern very similar at 9,000 feet. Let's focus on turbulence here. A light chop possible around St. Lawrence Island, St. Matthew and the Pribilofs, as well as many of the western capes down into Bristol Bay. Most of that will be below 4,000 feet. We'll probably expect some stronger winds and gusts and likely low-level wind shear from time to time in some of those gap-prone areas across the chain. Occasional moderate could be possible as we go throughout your day. But most of the thumps and bumps will occur out across western Alaska, where southeast, south central, the interior, and the North Slope, as well as Seward Peninsula, are looking pretty calm and stable at this point. That's a look at your aviation forecast. I'll be back with a sea ice update here in just a few minutes.
Now there is another section to the remarks field, and it's called Additive and Automated Maintenance Data. Pretty exciting stuff, I think. But let's take a look at the information we're going to find in this section. First of all, you might find temperature and dew point in tenths of degrees C, and that's the hourly temperature and dew point, hourly precipitation amounts, 3 and 6 hour precipitation amounts, 6 hour maximum temperature, 6 hour minimum temperature, 24 hour maximum minimum temperatures, and the sensor status indicators. Now let's take a look at how we might look at this when we look at a actual METAR here. And here we have the temperature field. It says T, and the temperature field begins with the T for temperature and has a single character here, and that character can either be a 0 or 1. And if it's a 0, it means the temperature is a plus temperature. If it's a 1, it means the temperature is a minus temperature. And it also tells you the temperature, and the purpose of this field is to tell you the temperature more precisely, because with Celsius we lose a little bit of resolution, and it's important when you're a pilot to know sometimes, particularly when the temperature is around freezing, to the 10th of a degree. Fahrenheit has a little bit more resolution. We didn't need that, but with Celsius we really need that. So what we're going to do is put a decimal point right here, and we can find out the temperature is 17.6 degrees. It rounded out to 18 degrees. Now the dew point is the second 4 digits here. First of all, this is the field that tells you whether it's plus or minus, and because it's a 0, it's plus. And here it's 16.2 degrees, and that rounds off to 16 degrees. So it gives us a little bit more resolution, a little bit more information, and it's going to be important to us if we're around the freezing point. Let's do another one just to get an example of what one looks like with a minus. Here we have temperature, and that 1 tells you it's a minus temperature, and it works out to 6.4 degrees. Here we have the dew point. The 1 tells you it's also minus, and it works out to 7.4 degrees. So you see it gives you a little bit more resolution and a little bit more help than you would have had otherwise. Now let's take a look at some other indicators you might find in this section of the remarks. And for instance, it might tell you that RVR is not available, or the precipitation identifier is not available, or thunderstorm information is not available. These are the kinds of things you might find. And here's one more important indicator you might find, and it's what's known as a maintenance flag. It tells the people who are working on this thing whether maintenance might be needed on the system. Looks like a lot of money is going to be involved, but it's not necessarily the case. That's just a handy thing. It does remind you of maintenance, doesn't it? But what it might tell you is that they just need to reset something, and they can do it remotely. It doesn't even necessarily mean a trip out to the station. So now let's take a look at a METAR. We've been through the whole thing. It's time for you and I to see if we can't make some sense out of this. So let's take a look at the entire METAR and read it in its entirety. This is kind of our graduation for this thing. The METAR is for KDCA. Well, we recognize that as Washington National, and it's on the 11th day of the month at 1955 Zulu. And the first thing we're going to find out is the wind, remember? And the wind is from 230 degrees at 13 knots. The visibility is 1 1/2 statute miles. And the runway 17 left RVR is 2,600 feet. There is a thunderstorm with moderate rain. There is mist. And there's an overcast at 1,000 feet, and the type of clouds is cumulonimbus. The temperature in degrees C or Celsius is 18. The dew point is 16. The altimeter setting, and this tells you it's in inches of mercury, is 29.92. And the remarks say that we have an AO2 that's giving us this report, and we have lightning and clouds, and the thunderstorm began 25 minutes after the hour. The sea level pressure is 1013.2. And the temperature, for more resolution, to get more information out of it, is plus 17.6 degrees C, and the dew point is plus 16.2 degrees C, and this equal sign tells you that that's the end of the report. C, nothing to it. Now that you and I have actually passed our graduation test, we can take a look at some real weather here. There's some dash RA right there, I'm sure. And if you look very, very carefully, look right behind the wheels of this aircraft, you'll see it here. There it is. You see it, folks. PY. There's some spray going on. PY right there. All right, let's take a look at some more of these. And let's do something that's really fun. Let's demonstrate how good we are by actually reading some more of these METAR reports. You and I are really good, so let's demonstrate that. And all we're going to do, first of all, is answer the W questions. What? Well, the what says this is an aviation routine weather report. It's a METAR. The where question is, where is this? Oh, it's Abilene, Texas. You can see that right there. The when question says, when was this observation taken? And this observation was taken at the 23rd day of the month at 12:52 Zulu. Now notice there is no who. I'm not trying to tell you there is no rock group anymore. The who still exists. There's just no who field here. And that tells us, because we also have no AO1 in the remarks or AO2 in the remarks, No, who tells us this is a manual observation. So this was a manual observation in this particular case. And the last W that we want to talk about is the wind. The wind is from 270 degrees at 8 knots. The visibility is 2 statute miles. SM tells us statute miles. Also tells us that's the visibility field. The weather is light snow, rain, and mist. How about that? Now let's take a look at the sky condition. The sky condition is scattered clouds at 300 feet, and we're going to have some broken clouds over here at 700 feet. And by the way, the lowest layer of broken or overcast clouds is the ceiling, so the ceiling is that broken at 700 feet, and we have an overcast layer at 1,500 feet. Here we have the temperature and dew point. The temperature is 1. The dew point is -1. That doesn't stand for missing. That stands for minus, so it's -1. Those are in degrees Celsius. The altimeter setting, and this A tells us it's in inches of mercury, is 30.04. And the remarks say visibility in the sector visibility, north through east, is 1 mile. The tower visibility, by the way, is 3 miles. Tells us that right there. And the SNB 38 tells us the snow began 38 minutes after the hour. The pressure is falling rapidly, and this is the sea level pressure field. It says sea level pressure is, in this case we're going to add a 10 to make it closer to 1,000, 1013.9. And here is the better resolution on the temperature. The temperature is 0.8 degrees C. That rounds off to 1. And the dew point is minus. Because there is a 1 in that field, that tells us that's minus. Because there's 0 here, we know it's plus. Here it's minus. It's minus 1.4 degrees. And the equal sign tells us that's the end of this report.
Here's a new part of the report. We're taking a look at Cook Inlet here, and we're looking at the sea ice edge. You can see how that's come down to about 10 to 15 nautical miles north of Calgan Island and well into the Turbulence and northern parts of Cook Inlet region. As you get down toward Homer, though, here is Kachemak Bay. We've got a zoomed out region for you here. Here's the Homer Spit. There would be some low concentrations of ice there and in the upper end. So if you were down around Homer today and you went out to sea, or you went down to the Spit, had some coffee this morning, checking out what's left of any of the birds still hanging out there, and you thought that was ice? Sure was. It's been pretty cold for a while. There's also ice on some of the western capes and inlets there on the western side of Cook Inlet. It has been cold, and generally seas have been somewhat calmer in those protected areas. Sure, ice can form. And look what happens out west when that happens. Boy, it's cold in Kotzebue Sound, Norton Sound, and all the way into our western capes and into Bristol Bay, almost surrounding Nunivak Island. And here's that area up around the Chukchi Sea that I was saying hadn't quite filled in yet. It's probably not going to because of that stronger southerly wind sweeping up through the Bering Strait. Now, north of the Bering Strait, conditions are trying to close that off. We'll see how fast that shrinks north of St. Lawrence Island, but don't forget that southerly flow really is preventing a lot of that ice from filling in there across the north. Now, on to the marines and the seas as we look at southeast. Northerlies coming down through the inner channels there. Remember how we saw that tight pressure gradient there? The Lynn Canal, looking at winds up to 30 knots with a 7-foot sea, 10-knot winds there across Clarence Strait, 2-foot seas, and north and westerlies coming down the outer coast at around 15 with seas generally at 4 to 5 feet. A northwesterly push comes up to about 20 knots outside of Icy Cape and Cape Fairweather and down the coast, 15 to 20, 5-foot seas on the outside, and 3 to 5-foot seas on the inside with winds from 15 to 25 from the north on Tuesday. For South Central, a light and variable wind that helps the ice form there across northern parts of Cook Inlet. A variable wind west of the Barrens, more of a westerly flow as you get out into the western Gulf at 20 knots. Light and variable winds inside of Prince William Sound, small seas, and southwesterlies either side of Kodiak Island. The winds will come up a little bit more on Tuesday across the western Gulf, still holding on to about 20 knots for many locations there, 5 to 8-foot seas, 4-foot seas inside of Shelikof Strait. And we're draining out of that cold air with 15 to 20 knots with 2 to 4-foot seas inside of Cook Inlet, as long as there's no ice there to prevent the seas from occurring. Now across Bristol Bay, southeasterlies inside, they're 25 knots with a 4-foot sea, and southeasterlies also down the Bering Sea coast with seas as high as 8 feet. Southerlies for the Pacific coast, 25 to 30 knots with 8 to 10-foot seas on Monday. Now that comes up a little sharply around Sand Point to King Cove and westward 40 knots with a 17-foot sea by Tuesday. Easterlies in the Bristol Bay region 20 knots with 3-foot seas, 10-foot seas down the coast with a 35-knot wind. For the Aleutians, considerably stronger winds across the central and western chain, wrapping into the low pressure system there. 22-foot seas around Kiska and westward. Eastward, seas fall off sharply, 9 to 12-foot seas there, with winds up to 55 knots in many locations. So again, watching for storm force or at least high-end gales. 40 to 50 knot winds across the central and eastern chain of the Pacific coast, 30 knots south of Nikolsky and Unalaska with an 11-foot sea. As we get into Tuesday, those stronger winds shift eastward. You can see from Nikolsky to Atka, 30 to 50 knots there, 45 knots to the east, 5 to as high as 19-foot seas there across the eastern chain, 22 to 27-foot seas across the west with that southwesterly flow feeding into the system. And it will be getting colder with rain and snow showers in your region. Across the west coast, south and easterlies on either side of Nunivak Island, southwesterlies for St. Lawrence Island, southwest winds across the Pribilofs, 25 knots with an 11-foot sea. For Tuesday, easterlies across St. Lawrence Island, 20 knots there, 20-foot seas I should say, 20-foot seas for the Pribilofs with a southeasterly wind. And the southeasterlies also coming up the western capes and the coast, 30 to 35 knots with a 9 to 13-foot sea. Now as we get into the north slope, you'll see most areas there have ice underneath the wind speed. Of course, that means we're not predicting sea forecasts or sea heights anymore because of the concentration of ice. There's one location that still has it, and that's just west of Point Hope and Cape Lisburne with a southerly wind at 15 knots and a 3-foot sea there on Monday. Otherwise, westerlies across the north slope, 10 to 20 knots there. And as we get into Tuesday, a north and easterly flow remains light at 10 knots. Light winds from Wainwright all the way down toward Cape Lisburne, where we pick up a stronger easterly wind at 20 knots with a 4-foot sea, and light winds outside of Kotzebue Sound with a 15-knot wind there from the east. Recapping tonight's weather, things are fairly quiet across the interior, the north and the southwest and southeastern Alaska, but winds will be coming up there on the inside here in the next couple days. Out across the west, a front is working across the Bering. It's going to fall apart as it moves eastward, but it'll crank up a few snow showers across the western coast. Big cold continues for the central and eastern interior and south central as things continue to break down slowly across the Bering Sea. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather. See you again tomorrow.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Hi, I'm Chris Rognes, Director of Major and Planned Giving. If you're one of the over 7,000 individuals and families across our state who support Alaska Public Media, please accept our heartfelt gratitude. Every contribution and every member strengthens our community, ensuring all Alaskans are informed, connected, enlightened, and inspired. Thank you for your support and happy holidays.